Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 1, The Sons of 1492. I'm Brandon Seale. 4 horsemen sat on their mounts, surveying the Sinaloa River Valley in April of 1536. The horsemen didn't call the land before them Sinaloa, of course. It didn't even have a name in their language yet, because they were well beyond the borders of New Spain and the northernmost outposts of Castilian settlement. And that was by design. Strictly speaking, these 4 horsemen weren't supposed to be doing what they were doing. They were slavers, and by 1536, the enslavement of Native Americans was technically forbidden by their king. That said, the economy of New Spain still depended heavily on it. Castilians who came to the New World and dutifully served their superiors were granted encomiendas, huge tracts of land to be worked by the natives who were entrusted to their care. The natives working these encomiendas died at horrific rates, however, and encomienda owners were always in need of replacements. But by 1536, at least up here along the Pacific coast of Mexico, the slavers had run out of Indians to enslave. The natives had withdrawn into the mountains, abandoning their homes and fields, preferring starvation to capture. For the last 3 days, in fact, the 4 horsemen had roamed all over this beautiful, fertile coast and found nothing but abandoned cornfields, the natives always seemingly just out of their reach. And yet on this morning, here in April of 1536, the slavers couldn't shake the sensation that they were the ones being followed. So they broke camp that morning and decided to circle back the way they had come. They rode along together, erect in their saddles and alert to any hint of movement behind a bush or up on a ridge, when suddenly, and all at once, they spotted a mass moving toward them in the distance. It looked like a group of men, but they were here well beyond the range of any others of their countrymen, so they couldn't be Castilians, and they couldn't remember the last time that natives had mustered up the courage to approach them. As the mass neared them across the valley, it broke into discrete objects. 13 of them. They were men, the slavers soon realized. 11 of them appeared to be natives, with their long black hair, tattoos, wearing simple skins or loincloths. The slavers were surprised to observe these 11 walking straight toward them, straight toward the very men who had been terrorizing their homelands now for several years. In this, they were inspired by the example of the other 2 strange men walking in front of them, men who were, in truth, the real object of the slavers' attention. One of those 2 men had skin darker than all the others, darker than a Moor, as dark as the Africans that had just begun to arrive in the New World to replace the dying enslaved natives. The other man walking alongside him was cause for equal curiosity, because he looked, well, a lot like the horsemen. His hair and his beard were as light as theirs, lighter even, and his skin was seasoned a near permanent shade of pink, like a Castilian who had been in the sun for far too long. The 2 men were dressed just like the natives, only with some kind of ceremonial gourds or something around their waist, like they thought they were medicine men or something. But what in the world were a black man and a Castilian doing out here? The horsemen stood there, dumbstruck and stock still, even as the band of 13 drew nearer, until at last the band was within speaking range. In any other circumstance, the 4 horsemen would have hopped down from their mounts and placed the natives in chains. In any other circumstance, the natives would have fled. Yet they were all held in place, it seems, and at peace by the 2 bearded men occupying the no-man's land in between them. As surreal as it was for the 4 horsemen and for the natives, it must have been even more so for the 2 bearded men. What in the world should they say now? How could they explain to the 4 horsemen who they were and what they had seen in the previous decade? It had been almost 9 years since they had left the Iberian Peninsula, 8 years since they had landed in Florida with 300 of their fellow expeditionaries, 90% of whom they would leave buried along the Gulf Coast. 7 years since they had survived their first winter on Galveston Island. 6 years since they had been reduced to slavery and scattered amongst the Indians of the Texas coast. 5 years since one of them had won his freedom by making himself a merchant, only to return himself to slavery the next year in an effort to be closer to rumors of his companions nearby. 4 years since the 4 remaining survivors of that original Florida expedition had been reunited in the great South Texas prickly pear ranges. 3 years since those 4 had worked up the courage to finally escape from slavery and make their way overland to New Spain. 2 years since they had become the instruments for the near miraculous healings of hundreds, if not thousands, of Native Americans, culminating with the resurrection of a hand-to-God dead man and the surgical extraction of an arrowhead from another dying Indian's heart. And 1 year since they had found themselves the leaders of possibly one of the largest mass spiritual movements in the history of Native America. 600 of their followers, in fact, were still with them in the next valley over, where they'd left them with 2 other expedition survivors like themselves, at least till they could determine how things would go with the slavers whose trail they had picked up on 3 days before. Now, in the faces of the 4 slavers mounted there in front of them, the black man and the Castilian were looking at the end of their incredible journey. For many minutes, the groups remained, unmoving, Old Worlders and Native Americans staring at each other across an unbridgeable gap. At last, the Castilian-looking medicine man broke his silence and spoke. "My name is Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca. Take us to your captain." It was, more or less, Easter, 1536. And for all intents and purposes, the man who spoke those words had just come back from the dead. Because everyone knew that Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca had died, along with all 300 other of the men of Governor Pánfilo de Narváez's ill-fated Florida expedition that had been launched almost a decade before. In retrospect, their expedition seemed almost cursed from the start. On June 17th, 1527, 5 ships had sailed away from Sanlúcar de Barrameda on the Iberian Peninsula and out into the Atlantic Ocean. The ships carried approximately 590 men and 10 women. According to Professor Andrés Reséndez, of the 600, quote, 11% were letrados, men of letters, including notaries and secretaries, and not counting other professionals like physicians and friars. More than a quarter were merchants and artisans, and roughly a third consisted of men of the sea, sailors, pilots, pages, etc., end quote. Some of the men were veterans of the conquest of Mexico, or of Jamaica, or Cuba. 80 or so were hidalgos, or caballeros of the lower nobility of the Kingdom of Castile. 20 were couples, looking to start a new life across the ocean in a new land that they called La Florida, Florida. 6 were men of God, Franciscans more specifically, charged with looking out for the spiritual welfare of the expeditionaries and any Native Americans that they might meet. 5 were captains, military men charged with protecting what was fundamentally a private civilian expedition. And lastly, 2 executive officers and a scribe rounded out the senior staff, and they reported directly to the expedition leader, a hardened old one-eyed conquistador named Pánfilo de Narváez. The only post that Governor Narváez hadn't yet been able to fill was kind of an important one, that of the chief pilot. But Narváez had a plan. He had just seen a brand new map of the northern Gulf of Mexico, so he knew that someone out there had first-hand experience sailing those waters. That experience wasn't to be found on the Iberian Peninsula, however, and so Narváez trusted in his contacts from his decade that he had spent already in the Caribbean to help him find the right person once he got there. And no one seems to have really questioned him on it. Because it really was up to Narváez how to staff his expedition. He was, after all, the one funding it. Some of the mounted noblemen and officers had bought into the expedition, so to speak, selling or mortgaging parts of their estates in exchange for a share of the expedition's future profits. Yet most of the costs, and to be fair, most of the potential profits, fell to Narváez. And this was exactly the way the Castilian crown wanted it. In exchange for this nearly unlimited potential upside, expedition leaders were expected to venture as much of their own personal wealth as they could. all the crown asked for in return was its share, traditionally 1/5 of all the income. To make sure that the crown got this quinta real, or this royal fifth as they called it, the king did insist on appointing at least one officer to each New World expedition, the royal treasurer. And the man selected in this case by King Carlos to serve as the treasurer of the Narváez Expedition was a trim caballero in his late 30s who had spent his entire professional life in the service of the realm, one Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca had been born sometime around 1488 in the town of Jerez de la Frontera, where he had had a front seat to many of the most important events of his age. As its name, Jerez of the border in English, suggests, Jerez had been a border town between Christian and Muslim kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula for nearly 300 years. Then, after 800 years of fighting, on January 2nd, 1492, Queen Isabella of Castile and King Fernando II of Aragon completed the conquest of the Muslim Emirate of Granada. This marked the first time since before Charlemagne that the Iberian Peninsula fell entirely under Christian rule. Sitting on the banks of the Guadalquivir River, Jerez de la Frontera had also borne witness to nearly every expedition of Atlantic exploration that had left Castile in the previous century as well, starting with the rediscovery of the Canary Islands. Indeed, it had been Cabeza de Vaca's own grandfather, Pedro de Vera, who had completed the conquest of the Canary Islands in the 1480s. And then, in that same January of 1492, just a few weeks after they had conquered Granada, those same Catholic monarchs agreed to fund Christopher Columbus's 3-ship expedition to reach the East Indies by sailing west. As we all know, on October 12, 1492, that expedition made landfall in the Caribbean, setting off a wave of exploration, conquest, and wealth creation, the likes of which Europe hadn't seen since Roman times. The impact of this reconquista of the Iberian Peninsula and the so-called discovery of the Americas when taken together is pretty hard to understate. The closest analogy that I can come up with in our lifetimes would be maybe the near contemporaneous end of the Cold War and the birth of the Internet. That is, if the Cold War had lasted 800 years and the birth of the Internet had been accompanied by the dislocation of 3 or 4 continents worth of people. And yet, like the birth of the Internet, this moment created a staggering amount of wealth. In the New World, men of modest means but immodest ambition could amass for themselves the kind of dynastic wealth that most men in history can only fantasize about. It was risky, to be sure, but the sons and daughters of 1492 were comfortable with that kind of risk and steeped in an ideology of service to their monarchs and to their Catholic faith. They genuinely felt themselves called upon to conquer and convert for the betterment of themselves, their king, and for the world. And it was the inhabitants of the southern part of the Kingdom of Castile, known as Andalusia, who disproportionately answered this call. The Americas came along at just the right time to absorb Andalusia's energetic next generation of conquistadors, and the Spanish spoken in the New World today actually reveals their influence there. In contrast to proper Castilian, New World Spanish, like the dialect of Andalusia in the 16th century, is marked by its preference for the indirect object le instead of lo, for its use of ustedes instead of vosotros, and its pronunciation of sibilants ceseo instead of cetheo, which frankly hurts my mouth even to mimic. Appropriately then, the principal city of Andalusia at this time, Seville, eventually came to hold the crown-sanctioned monopoly on trade with the New World. Through its ports would pass all the knowledge, all the men, and all the wealth of the Indies. And every ship of this age that sailed to or from Seville had to pass by Jerez de la Frontera, where Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca had been born into a caballero family of minor nobility. He appears to have been the third of 7 children, and the first son, though interestingly, he was the only child not to bear his father's last name, which of course was Vera. Instead, he was given his mother's last name, which wasn't terribly uncommon at the time, except that his mother's last name sounded as funny to contemporary ears as it does to ours. Cabeza de Vaca, cow's head. The apocryphal source for this peculiar name is an ancestor who marked a hidden trail with a cow's head for the Castilian army at the famed Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, but the name actually seems to be much older than that battle. Either way, Cabeza de Vaca himself never dwelled much on the origins of his last name, but he would go out of his way to identify himself with the conquistador grandfather whose name he didn't bear. For him, his paternal grandfather, Pedro de Vera, exemplified all the ideals of a Castilian civil servant. He was brave, defeating a Canary Island chieftain in personal combat. He was clever, using diplomacy as well as arms to effect his Canarian conquest. And he was dedicated to the Castilian ideal of royal service, even when it brought him little in the way of personal wealth. He was no saint, to be sure. He had actually been reprimanded for the enslavement and sale of Canary Island prisoners of war against the Crown's orders, but he had later dutifully returned most of his profits from this activity to the satisfaction of the mores of the time at least. And even here, in fact, his pragmatism and willingness to know when to back down seemed to model a behavior that Cabeza de Vaca admired. Cabeza de Vaca's parents both died in his youth, but his lineage ensured that he was given the opportunity to rise. In 1502, while still a teenager, he took up a post as a camarero, or steward, in the house of the Duke of Medina Sidonia, one of the most powerful men in Seville. A few years later, he was sent to fight in Castile's wars in Italy. He distinguished himself there sufficiently at the sieges of Ravenna and Bologna to be promoted to alferez and royal standard-bearer. He saw further combat with the king's forces during the Comunero Rebellion back in Seville from 1520 to 22, after which he returned to the duke's household. There, he took on roles of increasing responsibility and would eventually be trusted to represent the duke in certain matters at the royal court. Around 1520, Cabeza de Vaca married Maria Marmolejo from a prominent Conversa family. For background on that term, with the final triumph of Christian forces in the Reconquista, the Catholic monarchs became increasingly intolerant of other religions, expelling all Jews or requiring them to convert. Those who stayed and converted were widely known as conversos. Maria Marmolejo came from one of these Jewish families that had recently converted, something which didn't seem to bother the heritage-conscious Cabeza de Vaca, however, perhaps because in his hometown of Jerez de la Frontera, a long history of convivencia had prevailed, a sort of live-and-let-live attitude toward different religions. Despite having recently wed, and despite having advanced well professionally for his age and station, by 1522, Cabeza de Vaca might still have come to believe that he was missing out on the real excitement of his age. Stationed there in Seville, he was able to see firsthand the tidal wave of wealthy new hidalgos returning from Hernán Cortés's conquest of Mexico. Cabeza de Vaca's background was actually pretty similar to Cortés's. Cortés was just a few years older than Cabeza de Vaca, and had technically been born a hidalgo, one rung down the nobility ladder from Cabeza de Vaca. He had immigrated to the New World in 1504, when he was only 18 years old, and was granted there a small encomienda, or an estate that included a block of Indian slaves whose labor he controlled. Soon, he began to rise up the ranks of the Castilian administration of the Caribbean. In 1518, at the age of only 33 years old, he accepted a fairly innocuous mandate from the governor of Cuba to make contact with the Aztec Empire in Mexico. And from there, he went rogue. As soon as he had landed on Mexican shores, he began to forge alliances with native tribes, to extract tribute even, and to establish a direct line of communication with the Castilian court, bypassing the governor of Cuba who had sent him there. The governor of Cuba soon realized his error and sent an expedition of nearly 1,000 infantry and 80 horsemen to recall Cortés. To lead that expedition, he selected the very same Pánfilo de Narváez that we met earlier in this episode. The then 40-ish Narváez was an impressive specimen, the archetype of a conquistador. He was, quote, tall and muscular, with light hair turning to red, a ruddy beard, and a deep, booming voice, like that of one speaking in a vault, end quote. And even his detractors agreed that he was, if nothing else, quote, courageous. An experienced captain and leader of men, he figured prominently in the conquests of Jamaica in 1509 and then Cuba from 1511 to 1514. By 1519, he was the governor of Cuba's right-hand man, and had he not been back in Spain on official business when Cortés departed, he might very well have been the one tasked with the expedition to the Aztecs. What Narváez couldn't have known, however, when the governor of Cuba sent him on his recall expedition, was just how strong Cortés's position had become. Cortés had quickly realized that the Aztec emperor in Mexico sat atop a crumbling pyramid of disgruntled subject peoples. Cortés, cleverly, presented himself to these oppressed peoples as their liberator, and they welcomed it. They transferred their tribute payments to Cortés, whose revenue stream was then further augmented by the entirely counterproductive attempts of the Aztec emperor to pay Cortés so much money that he wouldn't want to march on his capital at Tenochtitlan. With all of this tribute and treasure flowing in, Cortés had no problem purchasing the loyalty of the men of Narváez's recall expedition, without Narváez even realizing it. No sooner had Narváez landed on the Mexican coast than his men abandoned him for Cortés's banner, and then surrounded and captured Narváez in a bloody fight that left him without the use of one eye. For the next 4 years, Pánfilo de Narváez wasted away in a Mexican jail cell. Only after years of personal pleas from Narváez's wife and some tireless lobbying by his allies at court did Cortés finally release the now one-eyed Narváez. After his release, Narváez returned to Castile and immediately began lobbying for a province in the New World of his own. He had something to prove now, and frankly, he had 4 years of lost wages to make up for too. And he also still had one of the more impressive resumes in the New World, and apparently retained enough favor at court that his proposal was well received. On December 11th, 1526, the crown awarded him La Florida, which interestingly did not include the modern-day Florida peninsula, but did include the entire northern rim of the Gulf of Mexico, all the way down to modern-day Tamaulipas. Narváez's grant of power wasn't unlimited, however. 6 Franciscans, who we actually mentioned briefly earlier, were appointed to go with him, not only to convert the natives to Christianity, but also to make sure that Narváez complied with the new Indian welfare law passed that same year in 1526. By 1526, the abuses of the native population by the conquerors of the Indies and of Mexico had become a topic of real concern back at court, thanks to men like Bartolomé de las Casas. Las Casas was a conquistador who had grown so disillusioned by what he saw that he had given up his encomienda, his estate with its retinue of Indian slaves, and become a Dominican friar, committed to advocating for the humanity and humane treatment of Native Americans. Under the new 1526 law, which Las Casas himself had helped promote, Native Americans could no longer be enslaved without a council of friars first agreeing that they had been captured in a just war. You can already sense the holes in this system, but it's important to note this growing concern in contemporary Castilian society for the welfare of the native populations of the Americas. And yet, there was another, probably even more powerful check that the crown imposed on Governor Narváez, which we've also alluded to earlier. The position of the royal treasurer, in this case, Álvar Nuñez Cabeza de Vaca. Though the royal treasurer was technically outranked by Governor and Expedition Commander Narváez, he didn't really report to him. Yes, he was definitely there to make sure that Narváez paid and reported all of his taxes, but Cabeza de Vaca was also tasked by the crown to, and here I'm paraphrasing a bit, quote, inform us extensively and particularly of every matter, especially of how our commands are obeyed and executed, of how the natives are treated, the teachings of the Indians in the Holy Faith, and in many other things of our service, as well as all the rest you see and I should be informed of, end quote. As this charge makes clear, Cabeza de Vaca's job was precisely to be a counterforce to Narváez, a chaperone at the party, to check his ego and undermine any untoward attempts at empire building on the part of the governor. If this sounds like a recipe for contentious office politics, you're right. But this was a feature, not a flaw of the Castilian system of administration, which always sought to balance the religious, military, and civil authorities vying for power. So after receiving his Florida grant in December of 1526, Governor Narváez relocated to Seville to recruit men, purchase ships, and provision his voyage. He eventually accepted 600 men and women into his expedition. Not just Castilians, but also Portuguese, Greeks, Black Africans, and Christianized Moors from North Africa, and even a few Native Americans that had immigrated from the New World to the Iberian Peninsula signed on. Who could resist the allure of the Americas? And Narváez, more than anyone, was in a hurry to get there. And so after only a few months of planning, in early June 1527, he ordered his 5 ships down the Guadalquivir, taking the crew one last time through the great valley of Andalusia and past Cabeza de Vaca's hometown, Jerez de la Frontera. And this is where, incidentally, Cabeza de Vaca more or less opens his account. Quote, "On the 17th of June of 1527, the governor Pánfilo de Narváez departed from Sanlúcar de Barrameda, empowered and mandated by your majesty to conquer and govern the provinces lying between the Rio de las Palmas and the Florida Peninsula." End quote. The Narváez expedition's first stop, about a month or so later, was the Canary Islands, Castile's first step into the game of transatlantic conquest, won by none other than Cabeza de Vaca's own grandfather. A month later still, near the end of August 1527, the expedition made port in Hispaniola, the site of Columbus's first colony. Then, soon thereafter, Cuba, where Narváez himself had made his fortune, and from which point Hernán Cortés had departed on his expedition to Mexico. Which is to say that every stop along the way seemed designed to remind the Narváez expeditionaries of the deeds of their forefathers and of the spectacular wealth that it had created for them and the crown that they served. Still, it's important to point out, as Professor Andrés Resendez does, that the men on this expedition weren't just, quote, gold-crazed conquistadors, end quote. 140 of them bailed in Hispaniola, forsaking the theoretical riches of conquest for the more steady work of a bustling port town. And the presence of the 10 wives on the voyage reminds us that at least some of these expeditionaries planned to make La Florida their permanent home. The Narváez expeditionaries were, like many later immigrants to the New World, a varied lot, seeking opportunity in whatever form it might take. Several months ago, I had the pleasure of having dinner with Isabel Benjumea and her father, one Rafael Benjumea Cabeza de Vaca. Yes, you heard that last name correctly. He's a direct blood relative. The phrase that Don Rafael gave me to help understand this ideology, this belief system that drove and inspired so many waves of Castilians to the ends of the earth, was the mandato real, the royal mandate. I suppose it's related to the idea that is sometimes rendered shorthand as gold, glory, and God, but I think it's actually more nuanced than that. They genuinely believed that by extending the Castilian realm, they were spreading the gospel, and that by spreading their faith, they were instructing the people they met in a better way of dealing with the hardships of life. Cabeza de Vaca himself puts the secular and religious aims of the expedition on equal footing, paraphrasing his commission as to, quote, conquer those lands and at the same time bring the natives to knowledge of the true faith and the true Lord and service to your majesty, end quote. Of course, there were those who mouthed the language of the mandato real to cloak their own self-interest. And there's a long tradition in the English-speaking world of holding Spain to account for this in the Black Legend and other pseudo-historical critiques. But somewhere on the spectrum, between the cynical Pánfilo de Narváez and the saintly Bartolomé de las Casas, there were a lot of regular people that were sincerely trying to live out this ideology. And yet by the time the Narváez expedition made it to Cuba, the high-minded mandato real was crashing into hard reality. First, the expedition struggled to even find enough supplies in the Caribbean to reprovision. And second, Narváez still hadn't found an experienced pilot. And so, upon arriving in Cuba, Narváez decided to divide his forces. So while he went out and searched for a pilot, he sent Cabeza de Vaca ahead with 2 of his ships to buy what supplies he could in the tiny port of Trinidad, Cuba. Now, the largest city in Cuba at the time had maybe 50 dwellings. Trinidad, from what we know, was smaller even than that. And its harbor offered little protection from the elements, something that Cabeza de Vaca and the others on his crew sensed when they pulled in sometime in November of 1527. And then, the sky started doing things that none of them had ever seen before. Cabeza de Vaca understates the lead-in here, quote, "The following morning, the weather began to look not good," end quote. No buena. Cabeza de Vaca and the 60 men under his command were about to become some of the first Europeans to experience a New World weather phenomenon that seemed to them like something out of Revelations. Recall, it was November, the tail end of hurricane season. And even the laws of nature, the Narváez expeditionaries were about to learn, operated differently in the New World. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on RivardReport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. We're telling important stories here, but a story's power comes from its being shared with others. So please, like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache. It is composed by Kevin Graham and available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andres Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State University, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. It's hard in podcast format to properly cite all the great sources that I've used for this series, but I have to make a special point here to acknowledge Rolena Adorno and Charles Patrick Pautz's 3-volume tome on Cabeza de Vaca, published by the University of Nebraska Press. It's everything you could ever want to know about Cabeza de Vaca and the Narváez Expedition, and a whole lot more. You can find a link to Adorno and Pautz's work, as well as all the other sources used in this series, at brandonseale.com.